Good evening, everyone. My name is Stuart Comer. I'm the Lonti Ebers Chief Curator of Media and Performance at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. As you can tell, I'm not actually at the museum at the moment, but speaking to you and live streaming from home. And I'm so delighted to be joined by the brilliant and pioneering artist, Joan Jonas. Joan, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you. I'm fine.
We so deeply regret that we can't actually welcome you into the physical galleries during this extremely precarious time, but we're so deeply grateful to have this opportunity to bring the museum and the art we love and care about to you at home for this, our 11th virtual view, Video Lives. Video Lives is our first online video exhibition hosted on MoMA magazine. The videos, of which there are 7, all from MoMA's collection, will be available online for the next week. A number of the videos, in particular Camille Rose Grosse Fatigue, generally are intended to be installed in a physical gallery. And so this is a very rare opportunity to be able to engage with them like this online in their entirety. So I want to thank all 7 artists for their work in particular, but also their generosity in sharing it with us on this platform at this time. So the 7 videos really chart a span of roughly 50 years, marking the early 1970s with Joan's own video, Vertical Roll, which really did revolutionize the field, all the way up to a recent video opus, Martine Sims, which she spent 4 years developing from 2014 to 2018. In between that time, obviously, technologies changed radically. The role of the camera in our daily lives became only more central. And life has really revolved around the camera, as we know all too well, as the world shifts fundamentally just based on iPhone footage, body cam footage, and a number of other new developments in how we record the world and disseminate that information very quickly. But this program was really devised while we were still in the heart of the earliest stages of the COVID crisis, while many of us, if not all of us, were really working from home and living to a degree in isolation that was unprecedented for many people. I think all of the works in this program, to some extent, deal with these kinds of claustrophobic spaces, personal spaces of work and life that are also suddenly made very public by the fact that the camera intrudes into these spaces and also disseminates them out into the public sphere. This is still a relatively recent phenomenon and one that we're all coming to grips with. And these artists in the program really have led the way in thinking about that. Joan is an artist who not only, I think, shifted the medium, but really shifted art making in general. The department that I oversee, Media and Performance, in many ways is a testament to her achievements with many peers in her generation who really worked across mediums, across disciplines, bridging video and performance and sculpture, amongst many other forms, to create really new and urgent ways of art making and ways of inhabiting the world. How they really thought about liveness in particular, the living image, the moving image, images that document performance and ways of coming together are all things that have deeply motivated our work in the Department of Media and Performance. And I also wanted this program to be a shout out to the role that women have played in the development of media and technology in general, something that has often been overlooked. Joan is clearly one of the singular figures and can really help us, I think, champion that narrative and that history, as we have also done at the moment in many works installed in our galleries, which I look forward to sharing with you once we're able to open the museum again. Works by artists such as Dara Birnbaum, Gretchen Bender, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, Wu Sang, and Trisha Donnelly. I also just quickly wanted to shout out to my colleagues at the museum who have made this program happen in the creative team. Huge thanks for allowing us to bring the museum to the public online in this manner. And also to several colleagues in my department who've had a long-term relationship with Joan and are also continuing to work with her for projects in the future. Erica Papernik-Shimizu, who beautifully installed Joan's landmark installation Mirage, which will again appear on our 4th floor when we reopen. Anna Yanevsky and Danielle Jackson, who are currently working with Joan on future projects, and Mari Ingram, who worked with me on this program and the 7 videos that I look forward to sharing with you on MoMA.org. I'd also like to offer a very special welcome to our wonderful community of MoMA members and donors. We so deeply appreciate your support, particularly at this critical time, and are so glad that you'll be with us here tonight. I also want to extend a very special thank you to our wonderful partner, Hyundai Card. They've made the Media and Performance program at MoMA possible, and we're extremely grateful for their support. And if you're not already a member of the Museum of Modern Art, please do consider joining. Your commitment to art and to artists and ideas has a very meaningful impact. You can join us online at moma.org/join. So Joan, I would really like to jump into the program really by starting at the beginning, because you are one of the few people really that has the long view on the history of video, really how it came into the art world. And I believe you were in Japan when you bought your first Sony Portapak camera.
Yes, I was.
And I think even the degree to which so much of your work is about travel, about thinking about anything from ethnography to ecology and landscape, it really suggests, again, this play between broader public spheres and these very intimate spaces in which you shot much of your early work. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about your rationale in buying that camera and how it led you to produce some of your most important early videos.
Well, before I went to Japan, there were people in New York who, of course, had a Portapak. That was what the camera was called. And so, and it was made by Sony in Japan. And I had made a trip to Japan, actually with Richard Serra, because he was in a show. And it was the logical place to buy one. And incidentally, I was very influenced and have continued to be by the No Japanese theater, which I saw there at that time. And so those things all came together at that time. And I brought the Portapak back to New York. And I just want to say, I say this over and over again, that it was a revolutionary thing at the time for artists to be able to sit in their loft with a camera and a monitor and to see themselves simultaneously. That was amazing. I don't think it's possible to understand without having been there how kind of revolutionary it was. But those moments happen, of course, periodically. So everybody has their moment like that.
But even prior to working with video, you were very active in the community of experimental filmmakers, and particularly the circle around Jonas Mekas and Anthology Film Archives in the East Village here in New York. Could you talk about your background and your love for cinema and how that then sort of translated or segued into your work in video?
All right, I just want to say again that for all of you young people, we didn't study any of this in school. So I was very interested in film, and there were many film theaters in New York. One could see all kinds of films, but primarily the Anthology Film Archives, which was right up the street, run by Jonas Mekas, was incredible, a film cinematheque. And they had, one could learn the history of film by going there every night, German, Japanese, French, and so on, and American. And so I was very interested in film. I wanted to make films. I did make two films, one with cameramen. Peter Campus was a cameraman on one, and anyway, another friend on Song Delay was the cameraman. So I made two films before I got my video camera, but film had a big influence on me. So my structure, when I began to make performance, I thought of what the different structures of time-based work was. And film is one of the structures, the idea of the montage, the narrative, and frame by frame. And all of that came into my language when I started working with video. I compared the technology of video to the technology of film. And every time I made a video work, I thought, how is this different? How can I make this? What is peculiar to video?
And vertical roll in particular is very interesting because, again, you still have that cellular frame by frame mechanism undergirding it. And the sound as well is very repetitive, and it suggests some of the artists and composers that were working alongside you in the community downtown, such as Stuart Comer or Alvin.
At that time, downtown, we all went to see each other's work. So artists of all disciplines intermingled and saw each other's work. But vertical roll, I'll just say briefly, I thought of the vertical roll and as frames in a film going by. So, and the vertical roll is a malfunction of the monitor, and all you had to do was turn a dial, and you could control this moving bar. And I'll explain briefly how it was made. We had a beautiful studio in Los Angeles that belonged to Robert Irwin, and the light was very diffuse, a very white kind of diffuse light. And there were two cameras involved and a monitor. One camera was trained on the monitor, filming what was on the monitor, recording. The other camera was held by the camera woman, Roberta Neiman, and she was filming me, and that camera was feeding into the monitor. You could not record the vertical roll. You had to record it off the monitor. You couldn't have it just happen. So you had to turn on the vertical roll and then record it. And so making the vertical roll involved me doing a continuous performance, walking around the room with the props in the right place, changing costume while she moved the camera. And to explain that last shot, the reason you see my head going down in front of the monitor with the vertical roll, that's between the camera and the monitor. I wanted to reveal that relationship. So at the very end, you see my head going into that space, revealing that was the situation, if you know what I mean.
And could you talk a little bit again about it just had a very different temporality, and this sort of notion of instant feedback really changed the way a lot of artists began to work.
Well, one saw oneself immediately, and so I wanted to make films. I called them little films. So you could make up all kinds of images. It was different from today in that you couldn't immediately transfer it to the public. You had to go through another, you had to go to a studio to edit it, or you had to find a way to take it off the camera and put it somewhere else so you could show it. So I don't know, it was the relation to the public, so it was indirect. But there was a place called Castelli Sonnabend, Tapes and Films. So there were very few places that showed video in those days, and that was one of them. And the Kitchen was another place where the Vasilkas, Stena and Woody Vasilkas, who were pioneer artists in the medium of video, and they started the Kitchen, and the Kitchen was another place where works like mine were shown, and theirs. Another thing I mentioned to you about the technology, about the machines, is that, for instance, the vertical roll, I just turned on a knob to make the vertical roll happen. So in a way it was hands-on, and special effects could be made in that very simple way. You didn't have to go through a computer or go to a studio. You could make your own special effects. And people took the cameras apart. The place where I rented my projectors from, when I used projectors in my performances, C.T. Louis on Chambers Street, you walked into the store and there were all these tables, and the tables were covered with parts. They took apart everything, and then put it back together again. And so the Vasilkas did the same thing. They took apart their equipment, and then they fashioned their own machines, their own devices to make certain effects. So that's a big difference between then and now, I think.
And the Kitchen was such an important crucible for bringing together new technologies like video with different forms of performance as well, and sound and music. The Vasilkas clearly were exploiting sound waves as much as they were, imaging technologies, and also where those two sort of dovetailed. But maybe this is a good moment to begin to discuss a little bit your background in performance as well, and this kind of fusion of the stage and the screen in your work. And as you mentioned, video did not have a lot of platforms to be presented. It wasn't really cinema. Oftentimes it was shown on monitors, but then gradually it became a more expansive and immersive form of installation. And then now, of course, it can be projected at a vast scale, in city and urban landscapes. But from very early on, I think you also kind of understood the role that it could play in capturing your performance work. And I think that has fundamentally changed the field.
Well, I always like to reach a different audience. And so sitting in my studio and making my little videos, that's kind of like being a poet and not knowing who your audience is. And so I wanted to bring it to another audience in performance. And as I'd been doing performances, of course, before I got the video camera, I began to think how I could use the video in relation to performance. So I'll just tell you briefly, an inspiration was seeing a photograph or a film of Marilyn Monroe sitting in front of a film camera and thinking, oh, the camera sees something very different from what I see. I see her profile and the camera, but the camera sees something very different. So that was really the main idea of my first video performances. And the video performances involved a live camera in the space with the performance, and the camera picked up a detail live of the performance and transferred it to a monitor and a projection. So the audience saw simultaneously the video image and the live performance, which made it, I liked that layering. And from then on, I got involved. I mean, I was always interested in different things going on at the same time, but that was the beginning of that layering device. And I'll also say quickly about the sound in vertical roll. You know, that sound, of course, when we were recording, by the way, there's no edits in vertical roll, but when we were recording, we didn't use sound at all. And I put the sound on later, and I lay down in front of the TV set and I clapped blocks of wood together in time to the vertical roll. So I recorded over the image. But yes, you're right. There are many wonderful, I saw so much wonderful music, and of course I was affected by that. But,
and then could you talk a little bit, because I think one of the things that really unites the works in this program, Video Lives, again, is the degree to which the artists did bring cameras into their personal space. And as you get closer to the recent past and works like Petra Courtwright's webcam, you know, the camera is already embedded in the computer. And so you're actively engaging the screen as much as you are the camera. And I love in that video how her eyes kind of dart around as she's actually kind of scrolling the contents of her own screen as much as she is actually looking at herself. But also, you know, platforms like YouTube, of course, which is how we're able to, you know, share much of our programming at the museum at the moment, also revolutionized people's access to be able to even see work like yours, which had often been almost impossible to see unless you went to certain kinds of museums or other platforms. And before we move on, as I'm mentioning YouTube, I did also just want to mention, we will be opening this up shortly for conversation and discussion based on questions from our MoMA members. And we've already received a number of really great questions. In order to submit your questions, you can actually do that in the YouTube chat feature next to the video, either to the right or below the video, depending on your device. So please do send your questions to membership@moma.org, and our producer will pass the questions along to me. Joan has a rich history, and I know there'll be a lot of great questions about it. But yeah, so back to you know, this idea, I think, of your personal space, Joan, and also looking at a work like Leticia Parente. And I don't know how much engagement you had with Latin America at the time, but there was a very vibrant scene of video making.
I know that, yeah.
You did go down, or
later? Her video, which is kind of, it's ridiculous. It reminded me of UNESCO, you know, the writer, UNESCO. He made a play called, "Oh Dad, Poor Dad, Mama's hung you in the closet and I'm feeling so bad." And I thought of that when I saw this video, you know, the absurdity of it. And it's a very strong image.
It is. And I think that the sense of claustrophobia is something that's also very present in works in the program by Sadie Benning, for instance.
Yeah.
But it's that space you discussed earlier where you were kind of sandwiched, you know, between the camera and the screen. And maybe could you talk, because some of your performances I always thought of as more expansive, using multiple layers, multiple screens, props, costumes, but to kind of reduce the space and vertical roll. What was your thinking at the time?
Well, you know, video itself is a very flat medium. And I think, you know, that's why filmmakers didn't like it very much at all at the beginning. And I also was reminded by Carl Reiner's death that video was really influenced by the comedians, you know, the way people on the television performers like Sid Caesar and Imogen Coca I watched when I was growing up, and they related to the camera. So we're all, you know, looking at the camera. We're all in front of the camera and relating to the camera. We're not pretending that the camera's not there. I think that's a major feature of the whole trajectory of video art to the present, actually. And it is claustrophobic, but there's something about video that demands that presence.
How much, I mean, you've already mentioned your collaborations with Richard Serra, amongst other artists and sculptors in particular. And I'm curious about how much you thought about the monitor itself as a sort of sculptural form, or the apparatus, not only of the camera, but of the monitor itself.
I thought of the monitor as a box, and I made several works in which I tried to construct spaces in the, like Glass Puzzle, I made spaces out of paper that the camera recorded. And so you looked in the monitor and you saw these different spaces. So I thought of the monitor as a box, which it was, and that I could climb into in different ways. And that's how I thought of the monitor. The monitor was an object, and it had a shiny surface like a mirror, like a glassed surface on the front, which we don't see anymore. So it was a very different device than what we have now with these flat screens. It wasn't flat like that.
And the metaphor of kind of climbing into it, I think maybe can also help us raise the question of women and the degree to which, so many women were working with this technology. And I think it raises a question about visibility and invisibility, and the degree to which, artists like you were really taking this technology into their hands to create a whole new lexicon of, feminist gestures, what it meant to be a woman in a society that often expected women to conform to very rigid stereotypes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was coming together of several things. The women's movement was on a very strong role in the 60s and the 70s when video technology came into being. And the sculpture and painting were more or less dominated by men. There were many women, of course, who were making sculpture and painting, but video and dance was really an area that one could go into. And dance, of course, was many women. There were men too, of course, but and video too. So you could, you didn't have to worry about that as a video artist. And I really thought that women were able to kind of scream into the video camera. They didn't actually scream, but they could express themselves in a way that they couldn't otherwise. So it was really a vehicle for getting it all out, and also in a very controlled way. Of course, sometimes like Beryl Corot made very structured pieces, but it was a vehicle for women.
And Beryl was very involved with radical software, and there were a lot of forums that were theorizing, the very radical possibilities of video, and, particularly also, guerrilla television movements. And many people dismissed video art as just television, or they assumed that it was a very sinister engagement with popular culture, and that it could never really be art. And how did you navigate those kinds of cliches and negativity?
Yeah, I didn't worry about it too much. There were many groups, and some of them were more political. They're very politically oriented groups and working with video, Paper Tiger TV. But I didn't worry about that, frankly. I just wanted to do my work, and I had a very clear idea about making time-based films, little vignettes and little narrative poetic pieces. That's what I wanted to do. And I myself was a performer. And at that time, I don't feel that way now, I was really involved with performing and dressing up and becoming another persona. Another artist we might mention is Jack Smith, who was also an incredible artist performing at that time in his loft downtown, dressing up, and he was a filmmaker. He was in the film world.
And also made some incredible slide performances, slide works also.
Oh my God, yes, he did.
But so speaking of performance, again, one of the really interesting things we have a number of really incredibly important works by you in our collection. And fairly recently, we acquired a later work called Reanimation. And works like Mirage or Reanimation are triple dated or have multiple dates to kind of suggest that, video and performance works are often, they're not a sculpture or a painting. They're not sort of a static object whose only major changes are through entropy, through the decay of paint or canvas. But these are works that really do change over time and evolve and morph. And often there's sort of a core notion that occupies different platforms. But you're dealing with a medium itself that evolves, and your work as well kind of parallels that system. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Mirage and Reanimation and just this idea of, going from the monitor and these single screen, single channel works to more expansive projects that really move the whole idea of documenting a performance beyond the idea of a still photograph or, potentially a film or video, but also to immerse a viewer in this kind of experiential space of an installation to convey the performance in a different way. Yeah, well,
Mirage, I'll say just a little bit about Mirage. Mirage was a piece, it began as a performance at the Anthology Film Archives, designed for that space with a moving screen and so on. And the material of Mirage was my last black and white performance with video projection in that time. And it continued to interest me afterwards. So I went back to it again and again, and I continued to develop it over the years. Now it is final, it's in a final form, but adding projections and reusing certain video parts that like the drawing film in Mirage began, I only used 5 minutes of it in the performance, and then now it's all 30 minutes of that. Reanimation is also a piece. It began with a very small performance in which I was making something for the camera. I was manipulating photographs and telling a story. I was working off of Haldor Laxness' book, Under the Glacier, which was written in 1965. So reanimation became about the melting of the glaciers eventually. But that's another action that I did over and over again from the very beginning, from the organic honey in the early 70s, was to show the audience, to demonstrate, to make things for the camera, to perform for the camera. They could see what I was doing. And I was interested that the result could be kind of magical looking, or I don't know what word to use, but it was actually just manipulating things with my hands. And I wanted to reveal the process of that. And so reanimation began, in part of reanimation that you have is that first video that I made with all the special effects by hand, for the camera. And then I became interested in enlarging it and shooting, going to like the Arctic Circle to shoot snow and ice, because it was about the glacier and so on. And so I enlarged that piece and added to it. And then after being in Japan for a few years and working with Soji screens, I wanted a situation in which the audience could walk into it, as they do with Mirage 2, and be surrounded by it, and have a more complicated experience of it. So it became much more about glaciers and melting and figure, as you know.
And prisms.
And
it's very prismatic.
Well, crystals, yeah.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good moment too. I mean, I've always been interested in sort of, prismatic, kaleidoscopic models of history. And you've had a long-term interest in the art historian Aby Warburg. And we were talking a little bit about his work earlier. And also, maybe it would be a good moment to talk about Camille Rose's video, Gross Fatigue, which is also in this program. I think there are many really interesting links between your work and Camille's, not least even just sort of the gesture of drawing and how that might relate, to other aspects of the video. But maybe just to go back to the prismatic or the kaleidoscopic idea, could you talk a bit about how you can model the layers? And your work often references as ancient folklore and fairy tales as much as it engages with very new technologies. So it deals with many, many layers of culture and history. And I think Camille's work does something very similar and tries to grapple with the origins of the universe through the laptop screen, through this one tiny little screen. And so that relationship is something you've been exploring throughout your entire career, the single screen, and then how that is situated, as every individual is, in a much more collective system or universe of many screens, many images that are only proliferating increasingly day by day. But just to go back to Aby Warburg, could you talk about your interest in him and just the model of history that's not fixed on a unified vision?
Yeah, I mean, I became interested in Aby Warburg because I was very interested in other cultures. And he, in the 19th century, visited the Southwest and became fascinated with the Hopi snake dance and the Hopi, which I could never deal with except indirectly. And when I began to research Aby Warburg, his interest, his method of connecting the past to the present, of connecting different cultures, of taking certain images like the gestures of the hands and showing images from India, from Greece, from South America, and so on. That was really the method that I've been using from the very beginning, because of using history in the work and bringing it into the work. And I saw this issue in Camille's work, that she's dealing also with these archives, and it becomes sort of like a history of the world. And hers has a kind of biblical overtone, like in the beginning, how did it begin? And it's a little bit yeah, it's like, it's sad in a way. There's certain sadness about it for me to see these creatures that have been archived, actually. Archived physically, but also archived in our, in the videos, in our images, and everything is recorded. And, but I think she does it really beautifully with these layers on the desktop. So that's a big difference between her work and the present and other people's, is that it's working with the desktop, and it's not at all a physical relationship. It's a virtual relationship to the material.
I mean, I think both of you frequently connect, new technologies with ecological concerns and also forms of ritual. I think it's something that really unites both bodies of work very powerfully. But could you talk just maybe one last thing before we start to open it up to questions from our audience too, about your interest in nature as well, and sort of natural or ecological systems or ecological crisis even?
Well, I've always been out in nature, and a lot of early work was shot in the nature. It's one of the landscape is my world, my background, my theater, my stage. And I think I began to focus on it in the way that you see in Reanimation, was when I read Haldor Laxness's novels. He describes nature in a very beautiful, poetic way. The miracle of bees, for instance. I made a piece called "They Come to Us Without a Word." It was in the Venice show, and it had one room about fish and one room about bees, for instance. And I became interested in researching these creatures. Also, Reanimation, Haldor Laxness, Under the Glacier. Glaciers are melting now. It's not like when he wrote it in the 65, when they weren't melting yet. So the world is changing, and it's certain things are disappearing. A lot of things are disappearing. And so I wanted to explore that. And I worked with children. I brought children into it in the Venice piece, because without saying anything, I just wanted them to be present as, seeing what we see them juxtaposed in this world in which they're going to inhabit. And so it's really my main concern. It's one of my main concerns now, is the natural world, because it's endlessly fascinating, to learn about these creatures and about the situation.
And the mediation of nature takes on a new meaning when many people are isolated and can no longer access it too. And as we open it up to questions, I just wanted to also mention my colleagues in the department also put together a great project on MoMA magazine called Performing at a Distance. And we've invited a number of artists whom we've worked with over the years to contribute a letter in this complex time, particularly kind of thinking through what it means to engage with liveness, performance, or models of assembly, even in a moment when we can't really come together and we can't stage performances in the same way in our institutions right now. And we published this week a very beautiful letter from Joan. So I want to make sure you all check that out, as well as you also watch Vertical Roll and the other videos in this program. But we have a question actually from my colleague, Michelle Kuo. And Michelle is a curator in our painting and sculpture department. And we're actually working together on a show that will be opening in the near future called Signals, the Politics of Video. But she's really interested, Joan, in how the shift from tape or analog video to digital has impacted your work, if at all.
Yeah, that's hard for me to answer that question. It didn't actually affect my work. I've always worked with the technology, the present technology, the technology at hand. I can talk about the shift from film to tape, where you could have a continuous running videotapes, where films didn't have such a long, you couldn't make such a long shot with a film, whereas video you could. And the same with digital technology. You can just shoot on and on and on. So in a way, I suppose you shoot a lot more material, and you have a lot more material to deal with. Your archives are, they grow. They're like monsters in a way, they grow. And I don't think, I think I've always had this feeling that I want to make the special effects. I'd like to make special effects myself using layering devices, using objects, using crystals, using drawing and juxtaposition. Of course, I work digitally, and it makes a big difference in the editing. I think the editing is the big advantage of having digital.
Yeah, it makes it easier. And my other colleague, Leah Dickerman, is also very interested in what you see as the critical changes and concerns in video art over the last few years in particular. But I mean, I would extend that to say over the 50 years you've been engaging with it.
The changes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just looking at your examples that you have, one is the this idea of the camera does not play the same role as it did in the beginning. I mean, the camera is my primary tool, and people still use cameras, but all different sizes of cameras. The small, the iPhones, the body cams, these little small cameras that you can swim with underwater. I mean, we have a huge amount of a choice with different kinds of cameras, and also the way the camera films, you get a different kind of picture. What I noticed with the people, that the videos in the group that you showed me, is a lot more interaction with found footage, public television, taking off the net, a lot more. And Martine Sims is a very good example of that. And so it's a whole different use of space now than it was in the beginning, in which you had a kind of box and you related to film. But now the space is flat, and the artists move in that space. For instance, this one of her images, they're all different sizes that she works with. And she also is a performer, and so she works with her image and alters it and so on. But so there's a mixture of her performing and quoting from, and it all adds up. There's one shot in this which I liked. It said, I think it said, finish these sentences or something like that. And I have the feeling that the whole work is about that. There are spaces between these images, not physical spaces, but mental spaces. And it's about us filling in those, finishing the sentences in a way, you know, because it doesn't come right out and say it explicitly.
And it's an interesting project in a couple of ways, but I think it kind of merges, you know, some of the strategies you've used in the past, particularly when she's filming herself. But as you mentioned, it also comes out of a history of, you know, artists more like Dara Birnbaum or Gretchen Bender, who are really dealing with media footage, appropriated. And I think she situates herself in that media culture. And so each of these 30-second clips, sometimes she refers to them as cantos or stanzas, and sometimes she refers to them as commercials or advertisements. And I think it's kind of hitting it on the nose, this idea that, you know, we can never really truly be independent from the consumer society in which we live. And then this kind of the commercialism of it kind of structures us. But then those clips can each be, when she shows this, particularly projected in a gallery, an algorithm runs it so that these clips are endlessly recombined. And so there's not one fixed sequence. So it is sort of like an open poem, to your point about, you know, the sentence is never fully finished.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Dara Birnbaum, because that was the moment of Dara's work coming out. That was a big shift to work with popular culture like that, Wonder Woman, to take a character like that. And that was a big shift along the way to this.
And Claire Fox has asked us, what have been your favorite cameras to work with over the years?
That's a funny question. I liked all of them, you know. I mean, first the Portapak, that was amazing. It was too heavy, and I wouldn't be able to manage that now in any way. It was really heavy. With the tape deck was heavy. Oh my God. And then for a while I couldn't afford cameras, because after the Portapak went out, you had to really work with camera crews because they didn't have cheap enough cameras, color cameras for artists. But then when color cameras, the smaller cameras came back and I could buy them, I've really loved all my cameras, you know, but I find cameras they're too complicated now. You know, there's too many little changes.
A lot going on.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could also talk a little bit about YouTube, or just, I mean, I remember when it started around 2007, and I had already been for many years programming, more obscure experimental films just so people could see them because they were so difficult to see. And suddenly a lot of that content became much more present. And I think, in my experience, a lot of students began engaging with histories of experimental film and video more than they ever had, and performance too. And has the internet had an impact on your work, do you think, or how it's even understood or discussed?
It's very hard for me to answer that. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I look at films all the time on the internet, and I look at cable TV. I look at narratives, and I'm interested in that. But I don't make things like that. But the history of film is very important. So it's really great that we can see all these things. And I just want to mention, the little camera. What's the one? It's this big, and you can use the underwater GoPro.
Yeah,
that was one of my favorite cameras. I like the GoPro. So I like many cameras, but.
And I mean, when you approach, especially when you're out shooting a glacier, for instance, do you tend to still work primarily on your own, or do you bring a team along, or how does it shift?
When I went out on that glacier trip, I have a friend, she's Norwegian. She took me to her house in the Arctic Circle. And in the winter, I wanted to go in the winter. And this is just an example. We got up every morning and she drove me around. I had my camera with me. I wore her snowsuit. And so in that case, she's an artist, A.K. Dolvin, her name is. So she's an artist and she helped me with that. She drove me around. So it depends. It's a different situation every time. When I shot Volcano Saga, I had a whole crew, because that was a time when I didn't have a camera. So I had to hire cameras. So it depends, it depends. I work a lot alone. I mean, I set the camera up and I perform in front of it. You can tell I put it on a tripod, and then, so a lot of times I'm alone, but I'm often with other people.
And Laura Lalinde has asked a related question. How do you view the relationship between performance and video within the practices of the artists presented in this program? How do they use these two elements in similar or different ways from one another, do you think?
I'm sorry, can you read that again?
Of course. She asks, how do you view the relationship between performance and video within the practices of the artists presented in this program? How do they use these two elements in similar or different ways from one another? And I might extend that just to say, very clearly now with Instagram and selfie culture and webcam life on camera, everybody is, and particularly I think since the COVID quarantine, people have really rethought this idea of performing themselves to camera. So now it's not just the purview of artists anymore. I think it's impacting all of us to a degree. And I think all the works in this program do deal with that in different ways, but it would be great to kind of hear your take on that.
Well, with the examples that you've given me, the latest examples, like Martine Sims, she performs in relation to the material that she inserts her performances in relation to the clips that she's taken from the internet and what she's recorded outdoors or wherever. I don't know where everything came from. There's another, oh dear, now I can't. There's an artist whose work I like quite a bit, and she works, for instance, I think skin has become very important in a very different way than it was before. Sorry, I can't remember her name. But anyway, she made a piece at the Serpentine Gallery, and one wall was
Sandra Perry.
Sandra Perry.
She's a great artist. Yeah.
Yeah, I love her work. Anyway, but so in that case, she's really focusing on her skin. And I think that's the skin color also. It's an important element. Wasn't certainly in the 70s, wasn't an issue in the same way at all. So very much the body. And also, I think that young artists, they work with avatars and gaming in a very different way than I do or my contemporaries did. The idea of the avatar.
surveillance as well, I think. It's
Surveillance.
taken on a very different meaning now. And actually, Leah Dickerman has also asked a question. Video has played such an important role in today's debates about the racial structures of our society. It makes visible things that are often officially denied, shines a light on different truths. How would you speak about the politics of video practice today?
Absolutely. I would repeat all that. I mean, shines a light on different truths, on inequality, on, that was a quote from the newspaper I used in my letter, shines the light on inequality. That's happening right now. It's been happening, but it's become much more visible. And just to mention Black Lives Matter, I've been looking at their films on, they've curated films on Netflix and Criterion. So I think that we're in a very important moment right now in relation to all these questions. It's quite urgent. And the fact that these events are recorded, like those I saw on Instagram, the big crowds, you know, that you would film the big crowds. I didn't go to any demonstrations. I wish I could have, but I couldn't. But to see that and to hear the voices in the streets, it's a very important moment and a pivotal moment that's very, very urgent. There's an urgency now about this situation.
I wonder, you mentioned Black Lives Matter as, I think one of the most, for me, compelling aspects of that movement is at the center of it, you know, are discourses about Black trans culture, about abolition feminism, you know, things that have not often been central to the public discourse in this country. And suddenly the conversation is not only about Blackness or anti-Black violence or how we can all better generate anti-racist behavior ourselves, but it really is also looking to marginalized communities within a marginalized community. And I guess as that is being framed and reframed again and again by all the cameras on the street, by footage of the police and their actions, you know, it's a fascinating moment. And it gets a bit back to this kind of idea of the prism, the kaleidoscope, you know, where multiple points of view are being brought to bear in this moment. And the camera is at the heart of all of it.
Yes, the small camera, the small camera.
And it is this idea of the portability of the camera. Not only can you bring it into your studio, but you can bring it out onto the street.
Right.
And I did want to talk to you a little bit about, you know, so many people have already discussed this, of course, but, you know, we went straight out of quarantine and into mass protests in the streets of New York and many other cities across the country. And so again, you know, trying to make the point I think that this program does try to engage with, which is that relationship between private and public space, and how the membrane between them is now the lens of the camera or the laptop, or, you know, they're kind of fused in a way. And how do you think this is going to continue to impact public life as well, including work like yours, but also the increasing centrality of cameras within our daily lives?
Well, I don't see how it's going to stop. I mean, I think it's going to go on. And I think it's very important that it continue and that it affect people's views on the inequalities, as we said, and all kinds of things. It's, yeah, we just have to hope that we can actually do something about things. We have to push for change. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it is, we have to continue to keep the energy going. That's what I think. The most important thing now, the energy that was released in the demonstrations, you know, everybody in and then everybody out in the street, that energy has to be kept going somehow. And we can just pray that it keeps going. I'm not, you know, that we all, I think communication is very important, that people will communicate with each other in a different way, sending images back and forth. And I think it will affect very much the way people make images. You know, it's a challenge. When you're going to put an image out there, it's either Instagram or something on the web. You have to think about what it is. On the other hand, it could be just a straight recording of something, but it's very important to keep that going.
Something, you know, for many years you taught at MIT in particular, but elsewhere, and having engaged with younger generations for a while, I mean, one of the things I find super interesting is that we're now probably into already 2 generations that have actually grown up with the internet. And, I grew up with television and cinema, but, was already out of college by the time the internet really began. And I'm just curious if you have any reflections, particularly looking at how the arc of the work in this program shifts. And you see works like Petra Kortwright's, again, where she is, trying to engage with the cam girl genre, where these women perform to the camera, usually in an erotic mode or with an erotic address to an audience that then comments, in the comments section on YouTube. And she exploits both the webcam, but also that frame of commentary. So just in terms of, I always say that younger artists of that generation are wired differently than I am, and I think their relationship to the screen and to the camera is fundamentally different, although I wouldn't be able to say exactly how different yet. But I'm wondering, especially through your history of teaching and engaging with younger artists, if you have any reflections on that.
I think they're much more involved with the outside world. I think in the beginning, we were all looking in a way, and we were sheltered from, we knew what was going on politically, and people certainly were political and had views and were outspoken and also active, but it was really looking in and not out. And now we're looking out. And I think that's a big difference, is that people are, I mean, at my MIT students, students are often not looking out. They're very involved with what's going on in their world. But now this being locked out, being locked in, I feel really bad for the students. I don't know what's going to happen. I think that's going to have a long-term effect on people. This remote, the idea of remote viewing, remote teaching, we don't know how that's going to affect young people. But I think these cameras are like windows into the world. So they're like our windows that we will look out of. And I think there'll be a lot more, I don't know, but I mean, a desire to communicate in a different way, for sure. I mean, you see that on Instagram.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that question of communication is a really important one. And it makes me think a little bit, your earliest work was made largely in Soho, and you were surrounded by a very tight-knit community of artists, all living in close proximity to one another. You didn't have to send, your videos halfway across the world to, friends in Asia or Brazil or,
No.
And now I think, there's just an assumption that this medium is a bit like liquid, that it can just quickly traverse the globe instantaneously and unite communities that could not have been united as easily, or certainly not as swiftly previously. But it's interesting to think about a generation that is actively kind of using their work with a different notion of community and a different notion of how to come together. And particularly in this moment when so many people are trying to find how to, as you said, keep this momentum moving forward. And I think it's going to be really interesting too. And I don't think of your work, as we already discussed, so much in the vein of media activism, even though you were certainly aligned with artists who were. But it does seem like it's going to play a particularly powerful role, I think, going forward. And when you look at the Arab Spring or any number of major political events over the last 10 or so years, and the degree to which Twitter and now Instagram have played a fundamental role in communicating where to be or when to be there, or just how to come together. It just seems like a critical tool. So maybe one final question as we have to start to close shop. But where would you take your camera next?
Oh, maybe China. No, I mean, I don't know when I'll be going anywhere, frankly, but the question of China came up recently. So maybe there, but maybe just in New York, to find a new way of looking at New York. I think that's important at times, not to always want the exotic faraway place. But there was a specific reason I mentioned China, but so maybe New York.
Well,
maybe
I hope to see you out on the streets of New York, and if not, I hope to see the footage you shoot in China.
Okay.
So Joan, thank you so much. And thanks to all the visitors and viewers out there for joining us this evening. If you weren't able to catch the whole show live, the video will be up on MoMA.org for viewing immediately after this stream concludes. We've actually had viewers tune in from all over the world. Further to my point, people are joining us literally now from Brazil, Buenos Aires, Toronto, San Francisco, Sao Paulo, Chicago, Mexico, Italy, Guatemala, rural Southwest Australia, Bogota, Virginia, the Philippines, Denmark, Cork, Ireland, and I'm leaving some out, but you get the gist. We're communicating through a global medium about one of the artists who really shifted that medium, and it's been an exciting conversation. Remember, you can stay up to date with everything that's happening at MoMA on magazine at MoMA.org, where you'll find much more information about Virtual Views video lives and Joan's work. And be sure to tune in next week for our next Virtual Views Live and Q&A, exploring the work of the great photographer Gordon Parks. My colleague, MoMA curator Sarah Meister, will be joined by two very special guests. I deeply appreciate all the help from my colleagues across the museum who've made this possible tonight, and thank everyone again for tuning in. Be well, enjoy more virtual views at the Museum of Modern Art over the weeks ahead, and we really do look forward to getting you back to 53rd Street and joining us at the museum as soon as it's possible to reopen, and we do hope it's soon. Have a great evening, and Joan, huge thanks again.
Thank you.